We now know Governor Doug Burgum will no longer be governor of North Dakota come December of this year. We also know he won't be president or vice president in 2025.
That doesn't mean that his political aspirations have ended, though. Valley News Team's Gabriel Osler breaks down a recent report and joins us live now in studio with more. Gabriel.
Yeah, if all goes the way Burgum would, he would still be high in the line of presidential succession. Those reports say he is angling for a potential nomination for Secretary of State. It's long been rumored that Burgum declined to seek another term as governor because he envisioned an appointment somewhere in Donald Trump's cabinet. He even made the short list for Trump's VP, which we know eventually went to J.D. Vance. Most speculated then that Burgum would be deemed Secretary of Agriculture or maybe Secretary of Energy, because both of those are specialties for the state of North Dakota. However, Axios is stating that both Burgum and Florida Senator Marco Rubio are in the running for Secretary of State, which of course is a much more prominent position. This does depend on if former President Trump actually wins the election in 2024, which is something that seems far less certain in recent weeks. Many say the Trump camp is coming off as overconfident by floating names of potential cabinet picks. Fun fact, though, of the so-called Trump surrogates like Vance or Rubio, nobody has been sent to more campaign events than Burgum. Justin, Stacy?